The mitzvah of putting on tefillin was given to us in the aftermath of the Exodus of Egypt. Remember that it is a pre-Matan Torah mitzvah. That gives it a certain measure of importance. Although you do have a very interesting question. The tefillin contains 4 paragraphs of the Torah. Shema, V'hayayim Shemoah, those are the first 2 paragraphs of Shema. And then Kadesh V'hayay Kiviyacha, which are the 2 paragraphs about the plague of the firstborn, in which the mitzvah of tefillin was given. So you really have a problem. If the mitzvah of tefillin was activated as soon as the Jews left Egypt, what did their tefillin contain? Because 2 of the 4 compartments represent a revelation that didn't occur yet. So did the first, like what if you could see if you could open up the tefillin that the Jews wore when they left Mitzrayim, right? Were 2 of the compartments empty? You know, that's an interesting question. Or was that part of the Torah, in fact, given earlier, even though it's not written in the Torah until later? That's something to think about. But be it as it may, tefillin is considered a pre-Matan Torah mitzvah. And we have, everyone knows, we have the tefillin of the Yad and the tefillin of the Rosh. And that signifies a very important idea, that the Yad is a person's physical strength and a person's physical abilities. And the Rosh is a person's mind and a person's ability to think. And essentially what a person is doing is, when they put on tefillin, is they are binding themselves to God on the level of thought, action, and also emotion, because tefillin is on the left hand. I'll talk about lefties in a moment. And the left hand is keneged the lev, the heart, which is that of emotion. So you're starting off your day in a very powerful way. I am tying myself to God with my mind, with my strength, with my emotions, and with my feelings. Right? That's what it is. And in fact, it's very interesting that under Torah law, you don't have to have the 7 windings. Under Torah law, as soon as you tie the bias to your bicep and put it on your head, the wrappings is not part of the Doraisa Dika mitzvah. The wrappings actually came much later. It's really from the Mekubalim. And they connected it to the 7 divine emanations, the 7 lower spheros. But you'll recall that when we finish wrapping our tefillin, on our hands, we quote a verse from the Navi Hoshea. Now, I want to digress a little bit and talk about the story of Hoshea, because it's a very, very unusual story. Hoshea was a prophet, and Hoshea was commanded at the beginning of the book of Hoshea to marry a very well-known prostitute. Kind of strange. A Navi. A Navi is the greatest of our tzaddikim. And he is told to marry a prostitute, and if Hashem tells him to do it, he does so. And lo and behold, she continues to practice her trade even after they are married. And the question is, why did God tell Hoshea to do this, and what was the purpose of this? So the Gemara in Pesachim gives us a very important backstory that it does not appear in the biblical text itself. And that is, when Hashem tells Hoshea, go and to give the Jewish people Musar, tell them to do tshuva, tell them to correct their averos. So Hoshea at one point says to God, why are we going through this again? Been there, done that. I mean, every Navi gives them Musar, they keep on doing sins. Hoshea actually said, why don't you just find another nation to make a covenant with? The opposite of Moshe Rabbeinu's response. When Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, I will destroy the Jewish people and I will make you into a great nation, what does Moshe Rabbeinu say? That if you're going to erase them, you're going to erase me. I don't want any private deals. But Hoshea, on the other hand, says, get rid of them. They're not worth it. So Hashem wanted Hoshea to understand something. What does it mean to love someone even though they're not so worthy of your love? And he wanted Hoshea to marry a woman that was really beneath him in every way, and she continued her immorality And according to halacha, by the way, he's mechuyev to divorce her. So God told him, why don't you get rid of her? And Hoshea said, it's very hard to divorce the woman that you truly love. He did fall in love with her. So God says to Hoshea, now you understand my problem, so to speak. I am stuck with the Jewish people. I am in love with the Jewish people. Yeah, they're not worthy, they're unfaithful. And of course, a very common biblical mashal is that the Jewish people are described as an unfaithful wife. That's a very common idea. An unfaithful wife who practices adultery against her husband. Idolatry is adultery. The words almost sound the same. So essentially, Hoshea had to internalize in his own life what it is HaKadosh Baruch Hu has with Bnei Yisrael. And that is why at the very end of the story of Hoshea, Hashem describes his relationship to Am Yisrael in the form of a loving marriage. And we say this every day when we finish with our tefillin. Ve'irastich li olam. I am betrothing you to me. This is Hashem speaking about us. I am betrothing you to me forever. Ve'irastich li. I am betrothing you to me. B'tzedek u'v'mishpat, with righteousness and with justice. U'b'chesed u'v'rachamim, and with kindness and with mercy. Ve'irastich li bi'amuna. I am betrothing you to me with utter faithfulness and loyalty. Amunah here means loyalty, essentially. V'yadat es Hashem. And you will know God in a very intimate way. Okay? By the way, you'll notice there are 7 expressions of endearment. Liolam, forever. Tzedek, with righteousness. Mishpat, justice. Chesed, loving kindness. Rachamim, mercy. Emunah is loyalty. V'yadat, and intimate knowledge. 7 expressions. According to some, this is the source of the minhag of why a kala walks around the chasan 7 times before the chuppah, because what's going on is these 7 expressions of endearment in God's marriage to the Jewish people. The kala is also praying and hoping that it should also be between the chasan and the kala. So there are other reasons, but that's one of the reasons. So think about this. When you put on your tefillin, we are reenacting the betrothal of Hashem to the Jewish people. Or we are betrothed to God, so to speak. So it's a very, very powerful idea. That's why tefillin needs to sometimes be disassociated from davening in the following way. A lot of times a person might say, if you're not yet totally committed or religious, I can't daven Shacharis. It takes too long. I can't spend 45 minutes or half an hour even. I can't do it. So it's important to know, maybe for this audience it's not important, you already are doing things, but it's important to know that putting on tefillin is independent of davening. So even if a person's not going to daven at all, put on the tefillin, take it off. You've done a great mitzvah. And of course, tefillin can be done anytime during the day. It doesn't have to be Shacharis. We don't wear tefillin at night, that's true. But you can put on tefillin, 2 minutes before sunset. And you will be Makayim, that great mitzvah. And I think in our experience, I found, other people have found, that tefillin itself can be a very powerful way of giving a person a sense of closeness to God. When people say, I'm only going to do one mitzvah, what should I do? So often we'll say Shabbos, Kashrus, which are big things, obviously. But Shabbos, Kashrus are very, very major commitments. And people might not always be ready for it. But one of the things that should be on your short list, if you're only going to do one mitzvah, which should it be? Tefillin could actually be on your short list, because tefillin can literally just take 3 minutes a day, and yet it has a very powerful impact on you, and the like. So it's something to think about. We should think about that tefillin. We take it for granted sometimes. When a bar mitzvah boy puts on tefillin, they've been looking forward to it for a very long time, from the time of 10 or whatever it would be, and they finally put on tefillin. It's so exciting, and it's so really, so it's a wonderful feeling. And then after a while, we all get jaded. after years, after decades, right? I did tefillin over and over and over again. But one should still have that sense of how beautiful and meaningful the mitzvah of tefillin is. Now, here is the thing. So it turns out, though, that the tefillin of the yad has two symbols. It is pledging your strength to God, but also pledging your emotions and feelings, because the tefillin is on the left hand, which is adjacent to the heart, right? So therefore there's a double meaning. Emotion and strength is in the tefillin shel yad, and the tefillin shel rosh is the pledging to use your mind and your intellect to understand Hashem. Now, two interesting points. We know halachically you have to put on the hand tefillin before the head tefillin. That's the order. Now, why is that so? Well, the technical reason why it's so is that that's the order that it's presented in the Shema. Ukeshartam lios al yadecha, you shall tie them as a sign, v'hayula totafos, and it should be frontlets between your eyes. So you're just following the order. First yad, then rosh. But spiritually, there's also a very important message here. Remember that when the Jewish people accepted the Torah, they used the famous phrase, Naseh v'nishma. We will do and we will learn. And the Mefarshim all point out that if they would have said Nishma v'naseh, that would have implied we will only do that which we understand. Nishma, we will understand, and from our understanding we will come to action. But Naseh v'nishma is exactly the opposite idea. Naseh is an unconditional submission to the will of God, even if it makes no sense, even if I don't understand it. And then I try to understand it. So Matan Torah involves an interesting paradox of sorts. On one hand, God calls for our blind, unquestioning obedience. And on the other hand, God says you should make it your life mission to endeavor to understand as much as you can. Now that's interesting. There actually are religions, in fact, different forms of Christianity took this position, that, for many, many centuries, maybe it's different today, the Catholic Church did not want lay people to read the Bible, because they didn't want the lay person to form his own understanding of things. They wanted it to be mediated through higher authority. The Druzes here in Israel, Druze are very fine people, right? The Druzes are kind of mysterious who they are exactly. They're not exactly Arabs, and they're not Muslims for sure, because Druze is a separate religion. But they're very odd people, but they're very loyal to the state of Israel, and they serve in the Israeli army. Great, great people. Some of them have actually been killed in terrorist events. So I have nothing against the Druzes, they're very fine. But they do have a kind of a crazy system in which they have sacred writings that the average Druze is not allowed to read. You have to have special training to be able to even see these books. So apparently there's a green hat. If you see a Druze with a green hat, that's like a special thing. They're like the Kohen Gadol, who is allowed to read. In other words, many religious traditions actually put a premium on ignorance. You will be told what to do. You are not supposed to understand. Now, Judaism is very unique, because not only does Judaism allow learning, but learning is like, emphasized and overemphasized again and again and again. Learn Torah, study Torah, master Torah. We want every single person to be a great rabbi, to be a great Talmid Chacham. One has to understand how utterly democratic Judaism is in that particular way, in which the treasures of the Torah are open to everybody. And not only do we permit it, we command it. So it's an interesting paradox. On one hand, God says, you must obey even if it makes no sense to you at all. If you condition your obedience on things making sense, you're not serving God, you're serving you. You're walking with God as far as you and God are fellow travelers, because you both have the same thoughts. But that's not serving God. Serving God is unconditional obedience. That's the message of the Akedah. Avram is told to kill his son. What type of God is going to give me that commandment? That makes no sense. Okay, got to do it anyway. At the same time, God says, you got to be willing to blindly follow me. And once you make that commitment, I want you to understand me to the best of your ability. That's Nasa v'nishma. You see the point. Nasa v'nishma. Not nishma v'nasa. Not let me understand and then I'll do. Nasa. I'm committed to doing even before I understand. And then v'nishma, I will try to understand. So the tefillin replicates a mini individualistic Kabbalah Satorah every day. I pledge my physical strength, abilities to God, and only afterwards will I endeavor to understand it. Nasa v'nishma. So tefillin shel yad and shel rosh follows the same pattern as nasa v'nishma. Now, another difference. Both the Yad and the Rosh have the same 4 paragraphs from the Torah, but they're written in a different way. In the Tefillin Shel Yad, I don't know if you've ever seen the inside of it, all 4 paragraphs are only written on a single thick parchment. I mean, you take like one piece of parchment, you write A, B, C, D, it's rolled up. In the Tefillin Shel Rosh, you'll notice 4 compartments. They're written on 4 separate pieces of parchment, and they have separate compartments, right? Those are the lines, right? They're not just grooves; they're actually compartments. They're glued together. I mean, if you were to take a knife and cut between them, you would see, like an accordion, it would open up into separate compartments. So this is interesting. What is the significance of the Yad being a unitary parsha and the Rosh being compartmentalized? So this could tie in with the same idea. That is, when it comes to the commitment to action, the submission to God, that's a complete thing, meaning to say that doesn't go in stages. Basically, you got to make a total commitment. Now, again, realistically, sometimes we have to take our time, but what God expects of us is a total commitment. But cognitive understanding, by definition, proceeds in stages. I first understand some things, then I go on. So compartmentalization is appropriate for cognitive progression in the understanding of Torah. First I know Chumash, then I know Mishnah. First I know basic pshat, then I can go into a deeper explanation. So by definition, things are compartmentalized. You can't understand everything at once. But your commitment to Hashem's will must be total and unitary. And that is why the Tefillin Shel Yad is one compartment, and the Tefillin Shel Rosh are multiple compartments. Now, the Gemara in Brachos says the following idea, that Hashem wears tefillin every day. Obviously, this cannot be understood in a literal sense. Hashem is not a body, so he's not tying leather boxes onto a body. But symbolically, at least, Hashem wears tefillin. And the Gemara asks the Kasha, we know what is inside our tefillin. What is inside God's tefillin? So the Gemara says, if in our tefillin we have the praises of Hashem. There's only one God who is like you, God. In Hashem's tefillin, he has the praises of Am Yisrael. Mi ki amcha Yisrael, who is like your nation Israel. Goy Echad, a unique nation in the world. So Hashem's tefillin is a praise of the Jewish people that he loves so much. Our tefillin is a praise of God. Some of you might remember, we don't say it here, except on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, Anim Zemiros. Anim Zemiros is recited in most Ashkenazi shuls in Chutz La'aretz, and actually Dati Liyumi shuls in Eretz Yisrael, not in the yeshiva world. It's recited Shabbos morning, and often a child will recite it. You can have a child below bar mitzvah who will sing Anim Zemiros. I don't know if anyone here, if you went to shul as that age, if you had a chance to ever sing Anam Zemiros. There are different nigunim for it and the like. Now, Anam Zemiros is a very, very mystical poem. It actually is heavily Kabbalistic. Very, very deep, very beautiful, but very, very deep. And it talks about many different images. But one of the verses, it's an Aleph Beis acrostic. Aleph Beis, each line begins with a different letter of the Aleph Beis. But in the letter for Pei, it says, Pe'ero Olai U'Pe'eri Alav. The word Pe'er is glory. Pe'ero Olai. His glory is upon me. U'Pe'eri, and my glory, Alav, is upon him. Now, you wouldn't know what that refers to, actually, but that's actually referring to the tefillin. Pe'ero, the glory of God is upon me when I wear my tefillin. Pe'eri, and my glory, alav, is upon God when God wears his tefillin, because God's tefillin is a praise of the Jewish people, and my tefillin is a praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay. So now I wanted to share with you a thought of the Netziv. Is there a chumash here? Can someone? Because I am going to read you some. This will be a little close textual analysis of two verses. Thank you. In Parsha. Oh, by the way, the Karaites. Interestingly enough, people always say that the Karaites who don't believe in the oral law have an overly literal interpretation of the Torah, right? We normally associate Karaitism with over-literalness. But tefillin is a very fascinating example where it works the opposite way. The Karaites do have tzitzis. If you go to a Karaite synagogue, not that you should go, you will see that they wear a talis just like our talis. They have tchelis, actually. They feel that tchelis was never lost. But the Karaites do not wear tefillin. Tefillin are not part of the Karaite ritual. They understand when it says, you shall tie it on your hand, and you should wear it between your eyes. They interpret it symbolically, that you're dedicating. We also believe in the symbol, but we believe the symbol is fulfilled in a literal way. They say it means you're pledging your strength to God, and you're committing your mind to God. And they actually do not have physical tefillin. So it's very interesting that B'dafka, when it comes to tefillin, the Karaites offer symbolic, metaphorical, non-literal interpretation, where the Rabbinites, which they call us, take the position that you have to read it literally. And so it's a fascinating reversal of literal versus symbolic. But however, keep in mind that obviously we have the symbolic meaning as well. That's what I was been talking about until now. Now, at the end of Parshas Bo, that is where you have the last two paragraphs that are in the tefillin itself. The first one is the beginning of Perek Yud Gimel, chapter 13, verse 1. And that begins, V'daber Hashem el Moshe Lemor, Kadesh li kol b'chor, right? That's the sanctification of the firstborn. Okay? And then at the end of that paragraph, going down to verse 9, Pasuk Tes, V'haya lecha lios al yadcha, it shall be a sign upon your hands, ulezikaron b'nei necha, and a remembrance between your eyes, L'man tia Torah Hashem b'picha, in order that the Torah of God should always be in your mouth. Ki biyad chazaka hotziacha Hashem mitzrayim, that God took you out of Egypt with a strong hand, with a mighty hand. Right, so that's the mitzvah of tefillin. Now then, the next parsha, when God brings you to Eretz Canaan, etc., and again, it talks some more details about redemption of the firstborn. But then, look at Pasuk Tesvav, and it repeats. It shall be a sign upon your hand, Right? So I want to just focus on two verses here. Let's look at the language of Pasuk Tes. And let's look at the language of Pasuk Tes Zayin. So it's within 8 verses. Pasuk 9 and Pasuk 16. Both of them, in a general way, say exactly the same thing. It shall be a sign upon your hand, and your remembrance between your eyes, meaning on your forehead, because that God took you out of Egypt with a strong hand. Why is there a need to repeat the same idea in the span of 7 verses? So, let's look at the verses. This would be an ideal for a PowerPoint. Let's look at the 2 verses exactly and try to note every difference between them. Pasuk Tes begins, V'haya lecha lios al yadcha. It shall be for you a sign upon your hand. Hand actually means arm, obviously. Now, look at Pasuk Tes Zayin. V'haya laos. So it does not say here, it shall be for you a sign. Instead of V'haya lecha lios, it says V'haya lios. Right? So difference number 1, Pasuk Tes says lecha for you. Pasuk Tes Zayin leaves out the for you. Al yadcha. Well, it says al yadcha in Pasuk Tes and al yadcha in Pasuk Tes Zayin, same word, but do you notice that it is spelled differently? Yadcha in Pasuk Tes is spelled the way it's always spelled. Yud Dalet final chaf. That's the way it's always spelled. In Pasuk Tes Zayin, Yadcha is an anomalous spelling. It's not a normal spelling. Yud Dalet chaf hey. So already in the first part of the verse, we see 2 discrepancies, 2 differences. The first pasuk has lecha, and the second one doesn't. The first pasuk spells yadcha normally, and the second spells it yud dalet chaf hey. Okay, so that's the hand tefillin. 2 discrepancies. Now, how do we then describe the head tefillin? So look at pasuk Tes. Ula zikaron beinei necha. It shall be a remembrance between your eyes. So the head tefillin is described as a remembrance. Look in Pasuk Tes Zayin, which is the same word that appears in the Shema. Ula totafos beinei necha. It shall be totafos. Totafos means an adornment. So, with respect to the head tefillin, we have one discrepancy. In Pasuk Tes, it is described as zikaron. In Pasuk Tes Zayin, it is described as totafos. Okay, so we have 2 discrepancies vis-a-vis tefillin shel yad, and 1 discrepancy vis-a-vis tefillin shel rosh. Now let's go on. Continuing in Pasuk Tes, it adds Laman tiyeh Torat Hashem b'picha. That the purpose of this is that the Torah of God should always be in your mouth. You should always be speaking about the Torah. Flip down to Pasuk Tes Zayin. Totally absent. The reason of Torat Hashem b'picha is simply not mentioned. It's skipped. Why is that? Why would it just skip what was stated in that earlier pasuk? Then, going back to Tes, I'll review it very quickly, what the discrepancies are. With a strong hand, Tes Zayin, ki b'chozek yad, hotzianu, Hashem in Mitzrayim. So you'll notice here two things. First, Pasuk Tes says Yad Chazaka, and Pasuk Tes Zayin says Chozek Yad. Now, I'm not even sure if the English translation has a difference here. Oh, let me see. I have an English translation. Let's see what they say here. Pasuk Tes, with a strong hand. Pasuk Tes Zayin says the same thing. This is a nice example of the fact that when you don't read the Torah in its original language, you're not even going to know there's a discrepancy. But there is, although it's hard to figure out what it is. One is Yad Chazaka, which means a strong hand. The other is Chozek Yad, the strength of a hand. I mean, why would the Torah invert the words that way? And you'll also notice that in Pasuk Tes, it is Lashon Yochid, Hotziacha. God took you out. It's a singular. In Pasuk Tes Zayin, Hotzianu, God took us out of Mitzrayim. Right? So one is a Yochid and one is a Rabbi. So what's interesting is that in just two verses, you have which seem to be saying virtually the same thing. We have all of these differences. And most Meforshim don't focus on this. Most Meforshim don't point it out. But the Netziv of Volozhin, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, of the great Volozhiner Yeshiva, in his great commentary on Chumash, Hamek Davor, and I hope over the years you've encountered it once in a while. It's not an easy parish, really, but the Netziv has a tremendous sensitivity to literary nuances and differences in language and the like. The Netziv starts off with a more general question. Bichlal, why does the Torah have to repeat the Mitzvah of Tefillin within 7 verses? Like, what's the point of even repeating it? And once we understand that, we'll then understand the differences. So the Netziv says that Tefillin actually serve 2 different functions. And the first mention of Tefillin is function A, and the second mention of Tefillin is function B. And the Torah mentions it twice because Tefillin has 2 distinct functions. One function is an internal function for me to recognize I am a servant of God. I am pledging my strength and my mind and my emotions to God. Now remember, you have to remember that the original way of fulfilling the mitzvah of tefillin was not just to wear it in the morning and take it off. The original mitzvah was to wear it the entire day. Even today, there are some people that do wear tefillin the entire day. This is the Zilberman school. This was the sheet of the Vilna Gaon. And Rav Scheinberg, Zichrono Livracha, wore tefillin. And there are, even to this day. This is not totally extinct. There are people who do wear tefillin the entire day. They only take it off when they go to the bathroom. But when they eat and drink, or if they go to sleep, whatever it is, but when they eat or drink or even go do business, they wear tefillin. Right? There is such an idea that tefillin should be on you the entire day. It happens to be that because of tefillin, you're supposed to always be thinking about Hashem. So the later generations were considered to be not able to live on that level. So because of that, we are not encouraged to do so. Meaning, if you were to ask a Rebbe, I'd like to wear tefillin the whole day, you would probably be told not to do it. But as I say, some people do wear tefillin the entire day. So you understand that if the tefillin is the constant reminder that I am the servant of God, so wearing it the whole day makes a lot of sense. I need to be reminded. I need this reminder, right? So that's one idea of tefillin. Tefillin is the internal understanding of submission to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's service on all levels of my being, emotional, physical, mental. But tefillin is also another symbol. There's a function B of tefillin. And again, today it's attenuated because we don't wear it outside. And that is, tefillin is your sign of distinction, your sign of glory, your sign, your badge of honor, that God has chosen you. And that's why the Gemara says the Chumash says that when the nations of the world will see the name of God is upon you, they will have fear of you. The Gemara says that means when they see your tefillin, they will see the Shekhinah upon you, and they will have pachad. They say, the Vilna Gaon, at one point, I mentioned the Vilna Gaon wore tefillin the whole day, that the Vilna Gaon at one point was arrested for various things. And interesting is, he didn't have papers or whatever it was. And he was actually brought to, he spent time in a jail cell. And we have different stories of that experience. But at some point he had to be brought to the judge, to a non-Jewish judge. And the Vilna Gaon didn't even want to look at those non-Jews. They were Rishaim. He didn't want to have his spiritual aura affected by contact with the Rishaim. So his talus was draped over his head like a blanket. Actually, you sometimes see this among breastlers who don't want to look at women at the airport. You ever see they kind of, they actually cover their heads that way. And the Vilna Gaon was brought to court, and the judge was very offended, and the judge said, "Take that cloth off him." And they took the cloth off him. And the Vilna Gaon's face was revealed, and the tefillin was on him. And the judge was seized with pachad. And the judge just said, "No, let the man go. Just get him out of here." Exactly the fulfillment of that pasuk. They will see you. Right? So you see that the tefillin is both an inner reminder and an outer mark of distinction. In fact, the Nitziv's Lashon is, tefillin is charban shel Yisrael. Tefillin is the sword of the Jew. Kind of gives us protection from enemies because the enemies see the divine presence is upon us. Charban shel Yisrael. So the Nitziv says, these two functions of tefillin are merumas in the repetition, kadesh and hayok eviyacha. That the first mention of tefillin is the internal function. And the second mention of tefillin is the mark of distinction and greatness and grandeur that it gives us in the eyes of the Umot HaOlam. And with this yesod, every single discrepancy gets a very, very beautiful interpretation. Let's look at the first group. You'll notice that in Pasuk Tes, it is for you a sign. In Pasuk Tes Zayin, it doesn't say for you a sign, it just says os, it's a sign. Answer, very simple. The first reference is the internal idea of submission to God as a slave, that I'm a slave of God. That is for me, the one who wears tefillin. It is for me a sign that this is what I'm doing. The second pasuk is referring to the Umot HaOlam, that it is a sign for them. So it doesn't say l'cha. It's not a sign for me. It's a sign for them, that they should perceive my distinction. Now, similarly, this is a little more complicated, the anomalous spelling of yadcha. Right, in the first paragraph, it's the regular spelling, yud dalet chaf. In the second paragraph, it's yud dalet chaf hey. Now, Lamaisa, the Gemara has a drasha about the anomalous spelling. And you split the Yud Dalet Chaf Hey into two words. Yad Keha. You wear your tefillin on the weaker arm. That is how we know you wear tefillin on the left hand instead of the right, because Yadcha is Yad Keha, the weaker hand. And that is why, indeed, a lefty whose dominant hand is left puts tefillin on the right hand. Now, this is actually a complicated area of halacha a little bit. What if, for example, you write with your right hand, but your left hand, you throw a baseball with your left hand? Like, how do you determine dominant hand? Okay, we don't have to get into all of the pratim. If anyone has a shaila, they should ask a Rav about tefillin and the like. But the overall concept that tefillin is in your weaker hand. Now, some people want to say, well, you want it to be opposite the heart, but that can't be the only reason. You understand that? Because if the idea would be opposite the heart, then even if I'm a lefty, my heart is still on my left, right? So why would I switch to my right? So the Gzeres HaKosav got to be the weaker hand. Now, why is that only in the second parsha and not in the first one? So here's what the Netziv says. This is a little bit of a drush. He says, when you wear a sword, you normally put your sword, you gird your sword on your weaker side. So if I'm a righty, I put my sword on my left so I'm able to take it out with some force. Right? It would be difficult for me, if I draw my sword with my right hand, it would be difficult for me to put my sword on my right. How do I get it out? So the remez is the Torah in the second parsha, which the tefillin is like your sword, it's your defense, it's your distinction, it's your greatness. That's where the Torah says, therefore, put it on your weaker side like you would your sword. In the first parsha, there's no reason to emphasize that idea, because that's just a matter of awareness of my power to God. That if I only had the first parsha, it might be more logical to put the tefillin on my stronger hand, because I'm pledging all of my strength. And that's why the halacha of Yad Keha is emphasized only in parsha number 2. Now, let's go now to the tefillin of the Rosh. In Pasuk Tes, it describes it as zikaron, a remembrance. A remembrance because it's for me. I have to remember what my mission in life is. But in the second parsha, it is described as totafot, an adornment of distinction, that the Umot HaOlam will see that God's name is upon me. Different function. Similarly, in the first parsha, it emphasizes, or the first pasuk, it emphasizes that the Torah of God shall be in your mouth, because that's the internal recognition of tefillin. That is omitted in the second, because vis-a-vis the Umot HaOlam, that's not the message to them. You see? Based on the two visions of tefillin, we see the difference. And finally, the difference between Yad Chazakah and Chozak Yad, which the Art Scroll translates exactly the same, a strong hand. But what is the difference? So Yad Chazakah actually refers, what does it mean? Like we say this in the Haggadah too. God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. So most of us actually misunderstand what that language, what that term is referring to. Most of us assume that refers to what God did to the Egyptians. In truth, Yad Chazakah refers to God imposing his rule upon us. Yad Chazakah. I've shown you what I can do. I've shown you my power. I've shown you my mastery. You are now my slaves. So Yad Chazakah is the imposition of God's rule upon the Israelites. So, since the first parsha of Tefillin, Pasuk Tes, is talking about what I internally accept, the kingdom of Hashem, it emphasizes that God made himself a melech through the strong hand of Mitzrayim, that he put on Mitzrayim. That taught me that I'm an Eved of Hashem. Now, Chozek Yad, Nitziv wants to say, is not referring, when it says God took us out, b'chozek yad, that's not referring to God's strength. That means God took us out and gave us strength and distinction and power. Very different. It's not that God has the Yad Chazakah, but God endowed us with the quality of Chozek Yad. And because of that distinction, the Umot HaOlam are going to have a pachad and a yira and a respect for us. Right? So all of these differences are understood by looking at tefillin in two different ways. Now, the truth of the matter is, the ultimate lesson here is that to be a slave of God is not a disgrace, but but it is the greatest of distinction. The distinction and honor that we could have in the eyes of the nations of the world stems from the unconditional submission we have to be the avadim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It is theme A that gives rise to theme B. They are connected. People think, if I want to be great, I need to be autonomous, I need to have my freedom, I need to have my liberty, I need to be able to do what I want. In point of fact, the truest and greatest of freedom is submission to the will of God. There was an Indian poet, Tagore, not Jewish, I don't even know if he knew Jews. He did win the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 1920s. But he's a very spiritual writer, and he writes about a lot of these themes. And he describes a human soul as a violin string. Take a string of a violin and cut it off, sever it from the instrument. Let it be totally free. It's unattached. It is not tied down in any way. What music can you get from a severed violin string? You will get nothing at all. How do you get music from a string? You tie it down. Now you might think that's counterintuitive. I'm taking away its freedom. And yet, it is precisely the submission that enables the beauty of the soul to come out. And we make a big mistake when we think the purpose of life is to be free. That can't be so, because for what purpose? What do you do with your freedom? Freedom might be an enabler. It might be something that enables me to achieve meaning in my life. And I would agree with that. When a person is free, they have the capacity to achieve something meaningful. But freedom cannot be the meaning. Freedom can only be the background that enables the achievement of meaning. And as a result, meaning requires a submission to something greater than yourself. And therefore, it is precisely the submission to Hashem, which is the first aspect of tefillin, that enables the glory in the eyes of the Umot HaOlam. That is the second idea of tefillin. Okay, so it's a wonderful diuk that two psukim, it's such a great exercise. You see the precision of the Torah, that two psukim that are 90% the same still have very distinct but overlapping messages. Okay, you have a good Shabbos and be well.